love that our theme is, May is for your mom, because so far it seems like May has not been for this mom. So, we had the Mother's Day catastrophe, right? And then we had, Stepmother's Day being the weekend after that. So realistically, we're recording that was just this past weekend. And Sunday night, the baby Reverend, we were out and about doing stuff, running around. And plus, like, we had just had that stomach bug altogether. And, went to put on his pull up for the night and noticed one of his dudes was significantly, like, huger. I don't even want to say larger. Like, it was, whoa, Mr. Reverend, I need you to stop everything and come look at this level of jarring. So that led, well, fortunately, I want to start at the top. It's not hurting him, like, at all. And so, like, I don't know, like, I never really tripped over to the bigger concern, but it was really funny because the Mr. Reverend was like, I think we need to go to the emergency room because this, and this, and it could be torsion. And that's not, like, I'm not saying that to accidentally, like, discredit his concerns because they were valid. We got on with, like, you gotta love the technology nowadays. Got on with, like, a virtual urgent care, and they're like, well, because, of course, bath time. So by the time we even got on with the urgent care person, he's asleep. And so now you're like, is it worth waking the toddler for? Like, can we just let him sleep and go in the morning? Which turned out that was what, the doctor said. And so it just, like, turned into all these hijinks of running around and discovering our system. I mean, I know we've talked about our healthcare system has its problems, but, like, it was really surreal because it just left me go, oh man, it's a good thing we don't have that nasty socialized medicine. Otherwise, you might have to wait 4 to 5 months to schedule with a doctor or wait hours in the emergency room waiting on a routine test and results, which is exactly what I lived yesterday. So when did we go to a socialized medical system, Tim? That is the question I have for you and our listeners even. Because, raised in Texas, they've always taken it kind of seriously, like, to kind of, like, get kids understanding how the world works so that you're prepared for voting and everything as you get older. And I legit remember hearing this is exactly why we don't want socialized medicine, right? So that was as I was able to deflect with humor, especially once we realized it was not an emergency. It's not that. He basically, if you want to look it up, it's called hydrocele, and that is hydro with CELE, if you want to educate yourself on boys' testicles. And things that can go wrong or arise or whatever. But they thought he had it when he was little. They thought he grew out of it. Our stomach bug adventure taught us, because of pressure and everything, right? Like how it can make a hernia worse. It just kind of, like, made the swelling came back. So we just got to learn that he still has it. Yeah. And I think one of the two of the funnier moments, I think, with this dude, and for being in the ER for 3 hours, he is an amazing toddler. And not to toot my own horn or anything, this is legit just feedback I get from random people. And when I say, oh, you're just saying that to be nice, they're like dead stare, like, no, you need to hear me. He is very well behaved. And I'm like, okay, got it. You want to let me know your perception is I am doing a good job because my child is well behaved. Thank you for trying to let me know. And so, he's like doing pretty well, even when he started to get hungry, and like, up, you can't eat until we know that you don't have to have emergency surgery, right? Because if it's torsion, you got to do that immediately or you can lose one or both of your boys. Ooh. Right? So that was why, like, we had to have it the same day. It wasn't that it was hurting him. It really wasn't even the most likely. It's just because it was a chance and they, like, put that up there with, like, losing a limb. They want you to go in and make damn sure that that's not what's going on. So, I got to say I was right to the Mr. Reverend, and it was just this hydrocele. But, like, the great moments in there is this toddler is just, and I need to stop calling him a toddler, he's getting older now, as this kid is, like, going through this, like, I see doctor, like, dentist. And I'm like, yeah, kind of like the dentist, buddy. And then fast forward a bit, and we're in the waiting room. Like, well, got to pee in a cup. And I was like, oh my gosh, the baby Reverend has never peed in a cup before. I get to explain this. And so I take him to the bathroom, and I crouch down. And first of all, of course, it smelled terrible. And he goes, ooh, smell like stinky. I'm like, yeah, buddy. And I was like, okay, man. So I got to ask you to do something a little different. I need you to pee in this cup. And he just, like, looks at me with this almost adorable puppy-like head tilt and goes, I pee in cup. I was like, yeah, buddy, you PP and cup did a great job. Got it all up there. And then fast forward, we're in there in the tech, they're doing the ultrasound to make sure what's going on. And, when this is going on, it's a bunch of fluid. And it almost looks like there's a little ball like floating around, right? Because you got, technical terms here, medical terms, testicle, and then fluid, right? And of course, you're a dude, so you probably understand this. For those at home that are learning along like me, as I am raising a boy, anytime you laugh, breathe, shift slightly, it can like make it move. And so the baby reverend is pointing and he's like, that inside my body. And the tech's like, yeah. And she's like, man, he's just turned 3. I was like, yeah, he's very, very curious and very good at asking questions now. And so he's watching it and he goes, oh, it dancing, wiggle dance like Danny Go. I'm glad it is what it is. So we got to schedule like with the specialist, like, because there are pediatric urologists out there. And very obviously you'd rather somebody trained in the teeny tiny scale of a teeny tiny boy stuff than, having to do it through the emergency room, which would be fine with how we can do things laparoscopically. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure it'd be fine, but I'm glad like we've caught it and it's nothing so serious that we had to do that. So that was my stepmother's day, which was also my anniversary. Because remember, I mentioned on Stepmother's Day that I became a stepmom on Stepmom's Day, and that happened to align again where Stepmom's Day was my anniversary. So Sunday. So Monday was when I was running around like taking care of everything. But
What past couple of weeks, I mean, like, this is one of those like time capsule deals that like 20, 30 years down the road, the baby reverend will be able to listen to this and he'll be like, one week, oh man, I threw up on my mom, and then the next week my nuts had to go to the hospital for my nuts.
My nuts tried to explode. Yeah. I mean, that's a super hyperbolic way to explain this. Like, it's funny because everyone's like, does it hurt? I was like, no, like, doesn't seem to bother him at all. So we're just back to monitoring and everything. And then, of course, like all of this is happening, stomach bugs, running to the emergency room for a basic scan. And, all along with, I mentioned I had an interview, so I can share some exciting news of one of the cool things that's happened is I did get that job. So I know, and I could still do literally too, by the way. Like, what's fun is I still get emails like when they get spikes. And for those of you that don't know, literally they had like a really hot sign-on time during the pandemic because they really needed people to do this. But I listen to reading attempts from children and I transcribe it phonetically for the teachers to understand how well their students are reading. So that's like, so I still get to do that too. And it doesn't like take away from anything. It's not going to take away from this. It's not going to take away from my ability to do that because it's nice that I can make like 10, maybe at best $15 in an hour, like doing literally like that at best when it's hopping. Like when you get the emails like, hey, we have a lot, so we're changing our rate because we need people to come on and do stuff. That's when you can actually make that. So I find it oddly therapeutic though. Like listening to little kids try their best at something. The only thing that gets me is every now and then you get a crappy adult, but super exciting times. And what's cool is I'm back in my admin stuff, which I'd have to say has been my favorite of the careers. And it's even inspiring some change in how we're trying to organize things in the background here for the show. So maybe we'll even get some improved show quality with my newfound interest in adminning again overall.
Yes, we could definitely use that here at Friends Talking Nerdy. We have over 400 episodes plus to show that being the case here. But look at that, people. Our friends are here. Welcome. This is Tim the Nerd, and joining us is the Reverend Tracy. Welcome to Friends Talking Nerdy. And this week we are going to be wrapping up the month of motherhood by talking about postpartum depression and anxiety. Take it away. I don't want to mansplain this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's like, sorry if I am not your favorite person to lead episodes, guys. Maybe May isn't your month either. We can at least relate there. But it did seem really appropriate for mom and stepmom, and especially postpartum depression, because this is something I went through and am still kind of coming out of. It felt more appropriate for me to lead these a little more heavily. So We'll dive into it. Yeah, postpartum depression and anxiety, basically when adaptation becomes overload. Because as we've talked about, like what's kind of cool about doing it the order we did is we get to kind of call back to a lot of the episodes. So I'm sorry if you're more episodically listening to us and not taking it in as things come out. So if we reference stuff, I am going to try to briefly explain it so you don't have to go back to the other episodes to understand. Just because I want to try to be courteous to whatever our listener style is. But right, like we talked about the physical changes that go on in the first week of this month, right? Because we were talking about that episode focused more on like the changes that somebody goes through neurologically, physically, etc. when you become a mother. Very biological stuff, never meant to undercut anybody who adopted or the other partner or anything. There's just some facts with that, right? But some of those same biological changes that help keep a newborn alive and make total sense when we talk about like evolution and how animals rear children and have instincts. But those changes that can make new mothers more vulnerable to postpartum depression and anxiety as well. And so I think like that's where I want to pivot and talk about, we talked about introducing this as like kind of tying it all together of how does everything we talked about, not even just in Motherhood Month, but even some of the stuff we talked about before in Illusion Month or just before in general, as we've talked about mental health and our culture, like how that has maybe exacerbated some of this stuff. And taken something that's kind of supposed to be this beautiful software update. If we can think of the brain as a computer, it's supposed to be a temporary software update to kind of help you with a task. But then it's almost turning that software update into kind of a virus, so to speak. So I want to try to like talk about it in that sense. I like that you're smiling and nodding. I'm trying to bring more of my analogy stuff into the show.
Yeah, we'll keep it going. You did brought a smile to my face.
But yeah, so when we talked about the psychology of becoming a mom, like I said, we talked about the maternal brain changes, attention changes, threat detection changes, emotional responsiveness changes. And honestly, that does make sense. A newborn is basically a tiny survival challenge that screams every few hours. So if a mother's brain didn't change to become more attentive or vigilant or emotionally responsive after birth, like that would be a problem from another evolutionary standpoint. So yeah, in many ways, the maternal brain is supposed to become more sensitive. And the interesting question is, what happens when those adaptive changes get pushed too far? Because postpartum depression and anxiety don't necessarily come from a completely different set of mechanisms. Sometimes they seem to come from the same systems just becoming more overwhelmed. The same systems we've talked about when we have the endless feed. The same systems we've talked about, when you don't have like physical friends around you and only have social media friends. So these are things that are also on the rise. And so when you think about how, right, like we live in the real world, we don't exist in a bubble with this. And we'll go into that a little bit more in another section. But like that makes sense though, right? Like we have kind of this natural temporary software update. But because we're running so many other things, our computer has a lot of stuff going on that's causing more drain. And we can even think of that like as cognitive load, right? I think you can probably speak to, you have a computer, you put too much shit on it. What happens, Tim? What happens when you try to run like software?
It can go really, really slow if it runs at all.
Right. And so that's more, those measurable postpartum changes in the brain. Right. And they involve all of that emotional processing, empathy, social cognition, and attention to infant cues. And what's fascinating is that the maternal brain isn't malfunctioning, right? Under that understanding, it is adapting. That's why I think sometimes postpartum anxiety and depression is less of a random defect and more of a situation where systems are designed to help the mom and baby succeed. But then they're becoming overloaded and dysregulated. And that's that recipe for postpartum depression and the many different ways that it can present.
I mean, imagine with just sleep alone, with a young child like that, getting up every couple of hours and crying and all that. The lack of sleep alone is going to make anybody, male or female, quite frazzled. And if you add in all of the other stuff that mothers have to go through, biologically, as we've talked about during Motherhood Month here, that could make things just so much worse.
Right. And let's not sit here and pretend like our sleep hygiene as a culture is great, right? Like, come on, we have commercials saying, okay, guys, 30 minutes before bedtime, you should turn off that phone. Okay, guys, you really shouldn't be scrolling with your phone in your bed at night. Okay, guys, you shouldn't be sleeping with the TV on. And it's not like people necessarily cut those habits like that affect sleep hygiene. So yeah, when you have like a baby that needs to eat every 1 to 2 hours and you already had very developed habits that were kind of going against your sleep, right? Like we can kind of see how that's a bit of that recipe for disaster. But yeah, so one of the strongest predictors of postpartum depression isn't necessarily childbirth itself, right? We've already talked about that. It's doing natural stuff. It's what someone was already carrying into motherhood, right? So we just touched on like habits. But often, I think people imagine postpartum depression is like something that just suddenly appears, right? You have baby and boom, depression. But a lot of research suggests that that's not really how that works. The baby doesn't arrive to a blank slate. The nervous system already has a history. And so we've talked about, if you already have depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, a trauma history, chronic stress. And we're even talking about that chronic stress that's caused by feeds. We've talked about this recently. And like not even getting into anything more complicated like complex PTSD, CPTSD. Those things don't disappear when you get pregnant. So in many cases, they're still there. And now we've added sleep deprivation, hormonal changes, physical recovery, identity shifts, and caregiving demands on top of anything you may have already had as a pre-existing condition. And anybody who has dealt with an anxiety disorder or depressive disorder or PTSD can tell you when you experience any of those things, how it can totally rock your shit. And that was actually something I had to really come to terms with when I was processing my postpartum depression, was because I do have diagnosed PTSD. I want to say I've been very honest about that. And I'm currently working on getting back in therapy because I want to get the appropriate diagnosis of what I suspect is CPTSD. And basically, when you, like a lot of the tools that I put together required a lot of the prefrontal cortex, right? Like what I've called my tool belt before. So like those coping mechanisms and routines that you do, and even like exercising being cortisol management. And when you go through those physical changes we talked about neurologically where they're measurable, guess what part gets donked with? The prefrontal cortex. So if you are a person that's like, but I had all of my mechanisms. I had my tool belt. I had all of the things that I built from like doing cognitive behavioral therapy, or if you did dialectic, and you might find that suddenly that's gone now. Like it's almost like you're driving down the highway and you had this really awesome toolkit and just out that window is fast, like just going 80 on the freeway. And so what you might find though is when you go back to try to collect those pieces and like remember the things that you did, some of the tools might still kind of work, but are a little broken. Some might not work at all. Some are probably still fine, right? So you kind of have to find what's going to work with you or work for you after you've had a major change in what's gone on. So it's just kind of an abrupt adjustment period with not a lot of guidance or access to help on how to navigate that. Like I still remember when I went in and I told them like, yeah, I've got the past diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and which later I think got updated to PTSD, was like how I kind of explained it. Because I felt like mine came as we learned things across decades, right? Like how people with ADHD sometimes are actually finding that it's really just executive dysfunction related to something else. Mm-hmm. As we learn things, diagnoses shift. So, and when I told them that, I still remember them looking at me. I was like, well, that's going to make you more likely to have postpartum depression and anxiety. And we don't have a lot of access to mental health here in New England. So good luck with that. Pat, pat. That's really how I feel that they prepared me for this going on during my pregnancy, which was not really saying it prepared me at all, right?
Wow. Good luck. I mean, that's what you want to hear from your doctor. Good luck.
Get in there and just get help.
I believe in you.
I believe in you. But how do I get help? Get them bootstraps and just pull them.
That's how we do it in America.
That is exactly how we do. Yeah, but that's basically what they were trying to express to me. Because yes, research does consistently identify prior depression and anxiety disorders are among the strongest risk factors for postpartum depression and anxiety. And it does make sense, like when you think about it, that would make you more likely. Like I felt like it was a bit naive of me to be like, oh, but that goes back to like not fully understanding or appreciating at the time how much my prefrontal cortex was going to get shaken up, because it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm more likely to have it. Well, I've already figured out all these ways and I've dealt with my other shit, so I should be able to rock this too, right? Yeah, if I can go back in time. I would
Wake
probably approach that
up.
with I would probably approach that with a slightly different attitude in hindsight. But yeah, like, and just to give this some perspective, anxiety disorders roughly affect 1 in 5 US adults each year, and women are diagnosed at higher rates than men. And then that goes into, obviously, trauma history is another important factor. Researchers study adverse child experiences. We brought those up as ACEs last time, and have found that earlier life adversity can increase vulnerability to later mental health challenges, right? And I mean, that's kind of a no duh, and that's not even necessarily saying like, oh, if you had ACE, you will definitely have, postpartum depression, anxiety specifically. It's really just, I think, the tone of those studies where if you have ACE, you're just more likely to have depression, anxiety, PTSD, depending on the level of the experience, CPTSD, and things like that. And so, but yeah, so the nervous system doesn't reset just because you get pregnant. It carries all of that history with you. And so when you consider this fact, and if you do go back and listen to some of the cognitive load stuff, and especially like if you listen to the Too Long Didn't Listen I did on the invisible job list, like these things, because it doesn't end, right? Like you have the baby and then you're dealing with this depression, and then you have all of this other stuff that kind of doesn't even start until after you've had the kid, right? Like all the scheduling and everything.
To me, it's like, if you think about it, like I can easily see where a mother is going to get easily overwhelmed. I mean, even if you're talking about a mother that had the most perfect of life, going to the point where they had a baby, and not having to deal with any sort of mental health issues like this, and maybe there are some people like that out there. Doubt it, but for example's sake here, I can see to where, even with the hypothetical example I just gave of a woman that has not had to deal with any sort of previous mental health issues, getting overwhelmed because of everything that is going on. I mean, it's like I said with the sleep issue alone, the lack of sleep that you get in the very early years of parenthood can make even the most sane person loopy. And adding in all of the mental health stuff that mothers have to go through, on top of the changes that your body goes through when you become a mother, on top of those feelings that you have, I need to protect my kid. I need to do this. Where's my kid? Why is my kid crying? Blah, blah, blah. And all that. That's going to throw anybody for a loop. And yeah.
You're right. Even somebody who has managed to exist in a bubble and kind of have none of the other stressors in life, right? And what's nice is, so we'll take a little sidestep because I want to talk a little bit about PPD versus PPA, and like how it kind of presents differently is not always the same experience. And then I want to loop back to a little bit of like, yeah, what you were talking about, of even if you kind of have, we'll throw it in some magical quotes, of a normal, uninteresting life, of things that can also factor in today's culture. But yeah, so when people hear postpartum depression, I think they often think like sadness, right? Like just kind of that you're sad. Maybe that you're too sad to take care of your kid. You're too sad to eat. You're too sad to take care of yourself. But postpartum anxiety can look completely different, and so can depression. Depression often looks like hopelessness, numbness, withdrawal, guilt, and feeling disconnected. I guess I can say and. But anxiety can look like racing thoughts, constant checking, excessive worry, inability to relax, and always anticipating disaster. And some moms don't feel depressed at all. They just feel terrified. And because postpartum anxiety gets talked about less, many women don't even realize there's a name for what they're experiencing. And that's even like to the phantom crying. I feel like every parent, and this is something that I feel like happens to the Mr. Reverend too, but I do feel like definitely talked about in mom groups, that phantom crying feeling. And I want to say it did make it into the show, talking about the phantom cry when the baby Reverend was like right next to me. Like that, I would hear it. And it goes to like, yeah, I do think maybe there's a little bit of that that's like phantom cry is maybe it's just some kind of weird internal alarm clock, like, hey, you should check on your baby. You know what I mean? Like you haven't heard anything in a minute. And I couldn't find anything on that. That was just like me speculating because as I unpacked this, I wanted to know like, well, what would the natural level of this look like? And so I did kind of wonder if maybe that was a timer because, of course, I'm not checking on the baby Reverend. He's right there. I'm checking with my side eye like every few minutes. And so it was really interesting to experience that. And I still do, in a sense, like when he's sleeping in another room, because it goes back to, we talked about before, 2 is when your brain starts going back to kind of normal. The gray area starts to reshift, but it's a starting process. It's not an overnight, and it can take years to go back. So I do think that to me kind of explained like why you experience it. But if you're hearing the phantom cry every few minutes, or like you can't get through a shower, because that's a popular one. Like it seems like when you're in the shower, that was like a common bonding haha experience in a lot of the groups I was in, was that like, why can't I get through a shower without a phantom cry? And it's like, that's why it's like these women would just have the baby like in the carrier on the ground, like in the bathroom with them, so that if they heard the phantom cry, they could at least look. And even me, I had like the baby monitor like up and kind of plugged in so that I could look really quick so that I could just take a shower. Because think about that, like especially like stay-at-home moms or single moms, you don't have another parent to pass off to just to enjoy a shower. So what? You're at most taking 5-minute PT rinses, like during like kind of a long time, and I almost felt uncomfortable. Now I will say like they did determine I had postpartum anxiety, so you got to take. I'm not saying my experience was normal. Got to take it with a grain of that. Like, yeah, like I had a hard time doing something as simple as taking a shower, even with the Mr. Reverend there, which I think was kind of one of those indicators, was that I couldn't use any amount of logic to soothe, like somebody else had it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like it had to be me. And in some ways I'm still like that. I feel it, but I am getting more able to use the logic of the Mr. Reverend's got him. He is a great dad. Like he knows what he's doing. He's not trying to like put on a diaper with a staple gun, as we'll probably go into some of those stereotypes we go into next month with Father's Day, because he has vented to me more than once about some of the messaging put out there about fathers and how they're kind of, displayed as being a bit useless when it comes to children. And I wonder if that plays into some of it too, as we talk this out. As if you're getting, we've talked about how normalization like works in the background of the brain. And if you're constantly getting this message that he's inept, I didn't think about that until just now. That might be another one that would cut some of that trust, right? Like he might be trying to staple the baby's diaper on.
Yeah. You've seen 3 men and a baby one too many times,
Yeah. But one of the most misunderstood parts of postpartum anxiety, I think, are those intrusive thoughts. And research suggests intrusive thoughts are extremely common among new parents. So even like my experience of just talking about it in a group, research does kind of back that up. So that's not just because I'm in a small pool that happens to have a lot of minnows. It is backed. And the important distinction is that intrusive thoughts are unwanted thoughts. They're often the exact opposite of someone's intentions, though. It's just like that's a constant intrusion, right? Like the intention is that you do want to be attentive to your child, right? Like that's actually a good intention behind a thought. But when it's like the constant intrusion where you can't enjoy a shower, you can't go cook something for yourself because you constantly have the intrusive thoughts. That's where it's saying like it's kind of taking away from what you actually want to do in your life.
Yeah, and imagine too how much worse it would be if you had a cat, because cats They only meow for humans. They don't really they don't when they interact with other cats meow, and they've adapted the meow because they instinctively realize that that is the same type of vocal sound that a baby makes when they cry. So
Right.
I can imagine how much more frustrating it would be if a cat were involved, during those early stages.
Yep. And so, like, what can piggyback off of those, phantom crying intrusive thoughts, but also you have to realize if you're having those intrusive thoughts, how that can kind of raise that chronic stress, right? And when you have chronic stress, what other intrusive thoughts can happen? I'm a shit parent. I'm screwing up my child. My child has something very wrong with it because it won't stop crying. So we must go to the emergency room. So those are the ones that start to take over, right? And especially when you start getting into this negative talk, like I'm crap, I'm going to hurt my child, da da da. And I guess a lot of experts really do believe that that's partly related to that natural heightened threat detection, right? To try to help anticipate danger. But the problem is your brain is the thing that's starting to become dangerous because it's kind of becoming that kind of too much of it, right? Because having that level of intrusive thought, by the way, is also just not evidence that you want to do something harmful. Because I think that is the misunderstanding with even non postpartum anxiety and intrusive thoughts altogether, is that you think that just because somebody has the intrusive thoughts, that's the same as, say, suicidal ideation. There is actually a little bit of a difference. And that misunderstanding alone creates a lot of shame for parents, right? That we don't feel comfortable talking about those intrusive thoughts when they tip over, when they go from the stuff that makes sense about care for the baby, and then they kind of get to that overwhelm where it's starting to become that you are attacking yourself. And that's the thing that has a tinge too much shame around it, because that even goes into some of our social media speak of like, well, if you're honest with yourself, you're probably a shitty parent. You know what I mean? It goes back to, we don't exist in a bubble, right? We have a lot of things that can influence these changes going on in our brain. And it's almost been kind of relieving to talk about some of this. So now we can go back into the myth of the single cause, which was kind of what you were starting to touch on of let's pretend that a lot of people exist that never experience like a trauma or have like any predisposition to anxiety or past diagnoses, right? One of the biggest mistakes we make when talking about mental health is pretending people live in a bubble with only one influence, right? Kind of the point that you were starting to touch on. Because people want one cause. We've talked about the simplicity bias. Oh, it's so easy because it's just this thing. It's just the hormones. It's just the baby. It's just sleep deprivation. But as we've kind of alluded to so far, humans don't work that way, right? Especially like when you look at our culture, because a new mom might simultaneously be recovering physically, sleep deprived, carrying previous anxiety, worried about finances, because we talked about that with some of like whenever you have, what was it, socioeconomic challenges and concerns, how that depletes your cognitive load. And so when you're right, like, so you already have kind of that baseline there too on an economic level. And then we also go into scrolling social media, being isolated from support because we've moved, as we talked about in the multi-generational home. We don't have the in-home tribe as much. There's not moving physically. Exercise is directly linked to mental health outcomes. And so when you're exhausted, because first of all, like say if you have a hard birth or if you have a cesarean, like you're not running a 5K when your baby is a month old, right? Like, and this is a little bit to my experience. I had blood pressure drops. Like I had a lot that kind of went into the pot that now that I'm kind of starting to be able to step back from it, for me personally, I see how much was kind of working against me. And in that processing, like you can kind of see how much works against just most people because we don't live in a bubble. None of these things exist independently. They stack. And sometimes we talk about postpartum depression like it happens in a laboratory, right? But moms aren't living in laboratories. They're living in the same economy, the same social media environment, and the same stress culture as everybody else that we've been kind of talking about. Like, as you kind of go through the theme of everything we kind of talk about with our culture being stressful to anybody, And so any one person then now experiencing the changes that go through when you have a kid, because the baby didn't arrive in 1955, the babies are now arriving in 2026 with
Yeah, and
2026 technology. Yeah.
yeah, and which is understandable. Like, yeah, we don't live in a bubble. There is no mythical person that doesn't have any sort of previous mental health issues going into this, and I can certainly relate as a parent myself. Those feelings you get when you do have young kids of, like, oh, I just did this. That's really going to F them up. They're going to go to therapy later in years because I messed up, X, Y, or Z as a parent, and which, may end up being true, but, it's still one of those things that, all parents are going to go through. And it does seem like, yeah, the conversation is not really allowed, if that makes sense. It's not encouraged to have these type of open discussions about the struggles that you go through.
Right. And then, what's funny is coming off of the stepmom episode, if you're in a high conflict, and even actually not even just blended, we could say blended families, right? Because if you're the mom in a divorce situation, you might remarry and you might have another kid. And if it's high conflict from a stepmonster situation, if you're a stepmom and it's high conflict from a mom situation, that also then affects that mental health even further, on top of the stuff we also talked about independently for the step parent that they experience very uniquely that we don't talk about much. So this all kind of made me ask a question during the research for this episode. I was like, well, wait a second. So how much has we measure this, how much has postpartum depression gone up? Right. And I found something fascinating because there's a large Kaiser Permanente study, and they found postpartum depression diagnoses increased from roughly 9.4% in 2010 to 19% in 2021. And that doesn't automatically mean postpartum depression itself doubled, right? But we can say that our environment has perhaps made it kind of a recipe to be more likely. Because what changed during that decade? Social media exploded. Economic pressures increased. Housing costs increased. We lost our multi-generational home. So loneliness has now increased because of the move to social media. Cognitive load and stress overload. This doesn't prove causation, but it does kind of reinforce the idea that mothers don't exist in isolation, from broader societal trends. And it would be foolish of us not to recognize that our culture is kind of that base broth soup recipe for anything you're going to add into your life, right? Because you don't get a choice on the culture. I mean, I guess maybe if you've got the means to jump country or be able to move, because it goes back to the United States has a lot of microcultures inside of it. If you are privileged enough, yeah, sure, you can change it. But for most people's experiences and for the culture of America as a whole, you don't get a lot of choice in what all is kind of background influencing your mental health. You do just exist where you exist and when.
Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to see numbers from previous eras as well. To in eras that, if we look back in history, we may have said were more of a golden age. People were more happy generally. If we think back and see if the numbers kind of corresponded to, because the 2021. That's a year after the pandemic first hit, and that could definitely be one of the causes why it bumped up into double digits at that particular time. And I think with our current political situation in the United States affecting so much out there, I can definitely understand why that would not help with postpartum depression or anxiety as well.
Yeah, so it looks like I was going to try to see if I could find something on that, but I don't want to give false information. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're curious about it, Google what it is today. See if you can find the Kaiser Permanente number. I don't want to distract too much and accidentally get in a rabbit hole and lose where I'm at on my notes. So, because I just found kind of a clear one. But now a point to be made, though, is I would anticipate that it probably remained the same or potentially got worse, right? Because we noticed there was a significant shift that we have not gone back to pre-pandemic, quote unquote, normal. That effectively shifted our culture quite a bit. Like, if anything, we got more into social media, and I'm not sure it backed back down, because it goes back into, it doesn't take long to establish new habits. And we definitely felt, the lockdowns and stuff were beyond those months, well, really weeks, because I think it takes weeks to like establish a new habit. And then we did it for months, and in some places a lot of those protocols carried over for a year or more, right? So it effectively changed some of our social grouping, just because it made us a lot more social media for getting some of our interactions, and even virtual meetings, blessing and curse that it is. You know, there's been some things that are really awesome that came out of the pandemic, but it would be foolish to not sit here and look at things that potentially have a negative effect, because that's exactly how you don't change and fix stuff, is by only talking about the good or only talking about the bad.
Yeah, I was not able to find that study.
Oh man. Well, I mean, it could be, I don't know how often do they do that, right? If it's like a census, how often do they update? You know what I mean? They might not do it every year. Because that's probably why that was the most recent number I could pull at the time, because it's really like, even now I tried to double check, like, why do I have 2021? I was like, oh, because that's the last one that I could find. But yeah, so, and then, the other interesting thing is, we also, speaking of the baby not being born in 1955 and not being born in a multi-generational home, we now also kind of have this other interesting, side to it, that we have the stay-at-home mom versus working moms. And the stressors may differ, but neither path is easy. And when you're struggling with postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, it still presents just in different ways, right? So for stay-at-home moms, one of the biggest challenges is cognitive overload. Again, referencing back, I did a too long didn't listen about the invisible job list that I think they did through salary.com. And that was super, super interesting, because what basically they were trying to do, almost for funsies, it seems, was assign what a salary would be for a stay-at-home parent. They focus more on stay-at-home moms because, that is the more likely situation, I guess, is still today. We talk about it. There's a rise in stay-at-home dads, but a lot of it is still stay-at-home moms. And basically they were trying to be like, well, you're the cook, you're an activities director, and trying to like find salary ties to that. And what they wound up kind of more talking about is how easily it becomes an overloaded situation, and how those jobs like don't exist independently from each other, but rather are all happening simultaneously and all at once. Like, whereas with a traditional job, you would have a workflow and you would have some separation between tasks. You don't get that when you're a stay-at-home parent. So you're doing all of the things all day, right? And especially if you're not implementing some of those things that, again, kind of requires the prefrontal cortex to be very good at, like time blocking, scheduling, even doing something like bullet journaling, as much as that to some people sounds insane for home, there's a lot more tasks now as for a stay-at-home parent, right? That invisible job list has only gotten bigger and more complicated. Think about paying bills. Like, that's gotten way more complicated than it used to be back in the day. And also now more traditionally taken over by the stay-at-home person, whereas more traditionally that used to be, if we're going back in time enough, where it's the man who is working and the man handled the finances. That's another job that's now. So we're actually getting more jobs as the stay-at-home person, and they're getting more complicated, not less. You have more subscription services. You have more bills that you have to go through and pay. You have more steps that you have to do to renew something, and conversations that you have to have. And you have to get the car checked up at 60,000 miles, 90,000 miles, and all that stuff. Don't forget those things. And then you still go into the other stuff's a little bit more normal, with like the scheduling appointments and doing those things, right? So yeah, appointments, diapers, clothes sizes, meals, supplies, developmental milestones, schedules. And those are actually still for the working mom too. A lot of that tends to get put on the mom, even though they are working. And if you have that unfortunate misbalance that is still common, even though we are talking about it, that for some reason, even though we're two-income households, it is like unevenly still the expectation that the female-bodied human of the house is doing the cleaning and doing the cooking and doing the laundry. So you can see where this gets really overwhelming for somebody who also has 9 to 5 duties. That you're not even supposed to really acknowledge those nagging thoughts that are telling you to think of the kid, right? Because then you have the complication of you are physically away from your child. Still have a good amount of that invisible job list. Even though some of the tasks may be more likely to be taken by your partner when you get home, there are still studies that show that women do tend to do a lot more of those house duties, right? So if you that's another recipe, right? That's another system overload, like cognitive overload, stress overload, right?
And it's something too for the husbands or the fathers in a situation, I should say, because I don't want to assume that people having kids are necessarily going to be married,
And even partners, because
even
insemination and the one that we talked about it, like when same-sex partners, when one goes through the physical birth but one doesn't, right? So that way too, partners.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it speaks to the importance of talking about this so that the partner in question can help alleviate some of that stress. Now, when you're living with people, when you live with another person and then a baby becomes involved, obviously everybody's going to have, their own separate responsibilities and all that stuff. And, there are going to be some things that what partner A is going to be able to do better than partner B and vice versa. But, the importance about talking about this type of situation is getting the partner on board with the fact that things are becoming overwhelming and, hey, maybe you can help out a little bit more at this point in time. It doesn't mean that, the partner in question is going to have to take over certain responsibilities for millennia or anything like that. But
right.
Especially during, these early stages of the child's life and the early stages of what the birth mother is going through, just talking about it allows help to happen faster, hopefully. And, and hopefully we're talking about people that will not want to have this traditional mindset of there are womanly duties and there are manly duties. F that.
Honestly, I don't think you get to hold that value when you don't have the privilege of allowing your woman all day for her womanly duties. If she's working a 9 to 5 right alongside with you, grow up. Do a freaking dish, rinse it, put it in the dishwasher. You probably have one. Most of us do. I also think it's really great that you can do like a clean in 15, Pinterest or Googling. You can find all sorts of hey, it's a checklist and everybody can have their assigned thing. Like you don't even have to worry about making the assignments, right? And being able to pitch in that way. But yeah, going back to kind of that difference between the stay at home and the working, researchers often talk about working parent stress through concepts like role strain or role conflict, right? Because that goes back into I'm over here and I'm not supposed to be worried because remember the babysitter's got it or the daycare or whatever. They've got the baby. I'm not supposed to be worried about it. But yet, we've talked about it. There's kind of that natural instinct. And it takes me back to I remember working in an office and a woman talking about she had just come back from maternity leave. And it was driving her crazy because she could swear she heard her baby crying every now and then. But she's at the office. So she knows logically she can't be. But then she gets distracted. Now she's thinking about the baby. And kind of to your point, too, is I wish our postpartum care did more than feet in the stirrups. I think there needs to be more focus on the mental health, not just come and check some boxes so that we can understand if you have postpartum depression or if you have postpartum anxiety. Kind of like how they walked me through the physical recuperation. I just wish there was more emphasis on the mental recuperation and keeping tabs on that and helping guide, because then if your partner is there with you, they can then hear it from a doctor's level. Whereas if they don't hear it from the doctor, unfortunately, what can happen sometimes is your partner complains about all the things they're feeling and the feelings. And sometimes it can get construed as, oh my God, they're being lazy, especially if they are full-time at home. And especially if there's no understanding of that invisible job list and how that really seems to affect people who are full-time at home more than people who are working and parents.
And think about some of the horror stories that you hear about women dealing with postpartum depression that have made some really horrific choices. We'll leave it at that. If we had a society that did value mental health and did value the giving people the opportunity to talk about it, how many of those stories would not have happened? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, like at the same time, research on cognitive load demonstrates that ongoing planning and monitoring consume mental resources. Like that goes back to even when we talked about economically, when you're constantly worried about bills. So therefore, when you're constantly worried about baby and you're constantly worried about bills and you're constantly worried about this deadline that you need for your boss, like you can see that it's chronic load. And that load exists no matter which role you're in. Stay at home, working. It's going to be there. It's just the shape of that stress changes, right? Where the stay-at-home parent seems to have more jobs because of that magic of being at home and having more expectations. Well, the working mom now has a task list from a completely different set of humans that you're not sure how much they give a shit about your little baby that you might be thinking about every 5 to 10 minutes, right? Because there's that nag in your brain. So the stress definitely doesn't disappear. It just the stressors kind of just shift. So this also goes into we've lost the village, right? Because we've got this whole thing that's kind of in common between the two is we're doing a lot more with a lot less help than we had not that long ago. We talked about how the nuclear family is the experiment in its infancy and how like we've kind of seen some signs like economically and even with mental health that kind of indicate that maybe that experiment isn't the best for us. So, and that goes back to we evolved in environments that were a village. So where child rearing was often shared among multiple adults. And kids tend to do better when they're watched by the small handful of same adults than, say, a rotating cast of employees at a place, for an example. And I want to make sure I'm super clear. If you are using childcare or preschool or anything like that, none of this is going to come from a place of judgment from me. We are all doing what we need to do to afford roofs over our heads and food in our bellies and things like that. And so if you have no choice but to use childcare, or even if that's just your preference, just understand there are some facts that go with that. And I think it's more important to be aware of than ignorant, like especially chosen ignorance too, just because we feel like that is the decision that we want or even need to make, right? So that being said, and especially like obviously don't try to reinstigate like a multi-generational home if you had a parent that like, yeah, I beat you and I feel good about it. Like you don't want that grandparent raising your child either. But right, one thing that keeps coming to mind is the multi-generational housing episode. And I was thinking about this because for most of human history, raising children happened inside that village, right? You had grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, extended family, older siblings that didn't just leave at 18. You had multiple adults helping share the workload. Right. And so realistically, they're not just coming in, eating, leaving a dish full of or a sink full of dishes and making everything harder on that mom. Right. Typically, there are roles they're doing. They're picking up after themselves. Maybe some of the adults do the dishes, like drying them, putting them away, or somebody's got dish rotation, like somebody's job is to unload. Right. You had more people to help. And many parents are trying to do the same job. And as we talked about, excessively getting more complicated job with dramatically less support than we've ever had historically. And so when people say it takes a village, that is not just a cute saying. That is because historically, it's often literally true.
And hopefully, something that we can get back to as time goes on. I mean, that, sucks for parents that have kids today, of course. But I think, like economically, we're going to probably get to a point to where people will have no real choice but to, live with multiple people, whether it be family members or, just, a bunch of roommates together that want to be, have, a shared life together, if that makes sense.
Oh, exactly. Like kind of like that co-space. You were roommates with me and the Mr. Reverend for a bit. I had a relationship with a fiance in the past where we had a roommate that stayed in there. It's actually really especially nice for that single person, right? Because they're kind of getting the benefit of living in a bigger space, but it being more affordable to them. And so, like, it goes back into your multi generational home doesn't have to be your actual siblings, it can be chosen family, right? We could totally make that pivot. And instead of accidentally swinging the pendulum back to the, well, there, that's your family, and so you should just, and you feel obligated to just keep them, maybe that middle pendulum correct is that, okay, but we can have chosen family. And maybe it's not a failure to be, especially if you're like the single person, like maybe you are, for example, solo poly, and you don't really want to partner with anybody, or maybe you're asexual to the tune of you don't really want to live with anybody, or whatever. If you just have that thing of you just want to be a single person and not necessarily couple your life, that sure is something that could make it a lot less expensive. And also, even if you are a dating person, like, boy, it would probably be nice to have a social support system in your own home to be able to like blow off some steam after a shitty date, or like talk about your relationship with maybe somebody that you can trust on a brain trust level, so that you're not just feeling like you need to fill a hole so that you have somebody to partner with, right? Because we talked about kind of our dating culture and how that's kind of crappy too. Like, you can have that support system like from like your chosen family as well. So I'm just saying like that we've definitely lost that support. It's not all for nothing though. Like, there are some justifiable reasons to not have your multi-generational home. But I think the pivot can be chosen family in that effect though, because the fact of the matter is we have a lot of stuff to keep a house going. And we want to sit here and be like, well, no wonder nobody has time to clean. And we've talked about that too when establishing new habits. Like, having clutter around you all the time also exacerbates cognitive load, decision fatigue. Like, so if you don't have time to clean, that is another thing that affects mental health, and therefore can be another stressor that puts you more in the likelihood of experiencing some PPD, PPA. I'm not saying a dirty house would be the sole reason. Again, we're talking about that we don't live in a bubble where only one thing happens. This again is another thing, because when you're doing everything, you're the only one doing the clean in 15 checklist. Meanwhile, more people in the house means, Tim, tell them that we had the chart, and you're smiling and nodding. We had the chart and we changed whose names was on what room. And there were some, because it's like, hey, like, I don't hate doing this, so I'll just do it all the time. I don't need to rotate. Does anybody love this chore that wants to rotate it with me? Like, we had that too. And it helped keep it clean. And let me tell you, it's a lot nicer than just us two adults with a toddler now, when you can share that. So we have to kind of recognize that with the good and the bad of it, we lost some good things with having a multi-generational home with many people in it. And it directly relates to this. And we go back to, I think the reason this is really, really important is because we do know that the mental health of your parent kind of affects you. So my mental health and how good I can be about fixing and addressing things is going to affect the baby reverend's outcome. It's going to have an influence on my bonus baby's outcomes. So the most responsible thing as a parent that I can do is figure it out and work on it, right? And before we actually get into that bit, though, I just wanted to close with a little bit more like anthropologists, right? Like talking about that history of being like in a tribe. And they frequently describe humans as cooperative breeders, meaning child rearing. I just love that term. I knew I wasn't going to be able to say it without laughing. Cooperative breeders. And what that means is child rearing has historically involved support from multiple adults beyond the biological parents. And you can see this actually in tribes, like, because that still exists. I know sometimes we forget that not everybody, has a Starbucks at every corner and 5 McDonald's. There are still tribal living cultures out there. And so while modern independence has brought many benefits, it has also reduced some of the built-in support systems that previous generations got the privilege of having and relied on. Right? Like, that was really important. So when support decreases while expectations remain high, and keep climbing because we have different technology shifts, right? Caregiver burden tends to increase. And sometimes what feels like a personal failure is actually a missing the support structure. So there you have it. Like, even when you look at humans as an animal, you look at it as if an alien was doing a documentary on it. They're going to talk about that very fact that for more of our history than not, we've had little tribes in our homes, right? And it's kind of like done that feature for us. And we don't seem to talk enough about the ripple effect of what we lost with that. And how do we compensate for it? Because it seems like we're trying to use social media to compensate for it. But Tim, last time I checked, you can't do dishes through Facebook Messenger, right? Like,
No. I mean, unless there's some form of a meta AI thing that's going to happen to where, I could do the dishes from here, for you over in Washington.
Well, at that point, I'll just get that robot that was humping that pizza prep table. I don't know if you saw that. There's a reel going around for a minute of these robots trying to do tasks, and just definitely in maybe the alpha stage of it. I don't think they quite got the bugs out to call it the beta. But yeah, there's one where it was having a good time with a cart, like a food cart.
I'm thinking of something totally different here, but there was this video I saw of this robot hand, and one finger was moving the screw really, really fast, and then it cuts to a woman like fanning herself or something.
I think I sent that to you, actually. Yeah. I think that was Taylor something. I really like her. She's pretty funny. She kind of, I almost said that in a way that it sounds like I wouldn't appreciate it. She went really political for a little while there, which kind of annoyed some people, but she's pretty funny. But I mean, we've talked about that. It makes sense. There's a lot going on. We can't all not talk about it. So that being said, and kind of tying back to what I was saying, is the best thing you can do for your kid is work on this, especially if you are experiencing it. And a lot of that needs to come with conversations and not having shame around it, because the existence of postpartum depression or anxiety doesn't mean someone is failing at motherhood, right? And ultimately, we need to be okay with asking for help, right? Because postpartum depression and anxiety being more prevalent, in many ways, it reflects how much the maternal brain is trying to carry. And that's talking about new identity, new responsibility, having a new human, sleep disruption, life stress, financial stress, relationship stress, right? We've talked about a lot of these things through this episode, I feel. And the social media scrolling, the same brain trying to keep a baby alive is carrying more than it can sustainably manage alone. And that is just piling more and more with kind of, like I was saying, the social media scrolls and that kind of accidentally replacing our in-person tribes, right? Unfortunately, most people are getting their social contact through what should be a supplemental system after what we've learned, right? But right, just with, depression, anxiety, PTSD, just really with anything, the strongest barrier to treatment is self-stigma. So as much as we have kind of gotten more accepting of people having these diagnoses, it's still a struggle for people to feel okay with it, especially, I think, with this having to do with motherhood, because there's a lot of narrative that still exists, even though there have been so many holes poked in this. I can't even tell you that this is somehow inherently a natural thing. You should just be naturally good at it. And while, like we've talked about it, there are some changes that happen that do make you naturally better at some things. And so I think we have a really hard time interpreting it when it accidentally goes overboard and starts attacking your system, right? And starts attacking yourself. But many mothers do interpret needing help as evidence that they're failing then, because this should be natural. This should be natural. But psychologically, recognizing that you need support is evidence that you're paying attention to what your mind and body are telling you, right? And that's a strength, not a failure. And we need to kind of be able to rein in on that, right? Because it's good that you can recognize it. What's more harmful is, for example, when it is an overload of depression and you just can't, to the point of that you're not even feeding your child, right? And you just can't even recognize that this is a problem. That is even the deeper scale of it, though. So if you are able to kind of be able to take those step back and even that shadow work of looking at yourself, if you want to look at it that way, and being able to identify that you could use some guidance and some help, by all means, go after it. And it doesn't have to necessarily be traditional therapy. If what works for you is maybe using those apps like Finch to just help encourage you to do some of the self-care, like make your bed, wash your face, take your vitamins, exercise. A little call back to something that made me laugh before is like, what they say, sleep when baby sleeps, exercise when baby exercise, get therapy while baby is getting therapy. So I do realize I am kind of saying, okay, just do more, right? But, ultimately, you have to be able to recognize when you need tools for help. And that's where it becomes you need to prioritize certain things. You can't say you're too busy for your mental health, because that goes back into if you really want to do what's best for your kiddo, and not to add guilt to this. But it really would be great if you can prioritize getting help for yourself so that you can be operating at your best mentally, so that you can be that present parent. You can be that responsive parent. You can have energy to play with your kid and take them to certain places so they can play with kids, right? Like, it is so important to be able to get help. And hey, for the partners out there, this is a little bit on you too, part of that responsibility of knowing the signs. And maybe this comes because I am the partner to a veteran, and there's a lot of education out there on, signs of, when PTSD is going awry, or when there's certain like indicators of maybe he should call the crisis line, etc. Like, there's a lot of education on that. And it would be great if we had better education for our partners to be able to help us too, and be like, hey, my partner really needs some help. And even if it's not something they can address directly with their partner, it would be great if there was a relationship, say, with the doctor, because that's part of the recovery process, is having your partner with you. Like, maybe they could say to the doctor, hey, I am concerned about this, this, and this, and I think it might be helpful if it came from you.
I think the thing to keep in mind if you are a young parent is that, some things, it's possible for some things to come naturally to you and for you to be good at them as a parent, but we're all winging it. We're all winging it. And you're going to have your struggles like anybody else. And the important thing is to talk to somebody if you do need help. It's like, I don't want to single out like, hyper religious people or anything like that, because, those are the people that you tend to think of when you think of, people that think, women can only do this and men can only do this. It's like, we have all of these resources that are out there that could help you deal with this. Get that help. Talk to somebody, get that help.
If you do have insurance, some of the things that I am learning is sometimes you can go through and get free virtual therapy. Sometimes there are programs where you get apps like Headspace for free. These are all very helpful things, especially if making an appointment feels overwhelming. Because I know for me, that was one of my biggest issues, was I was having a hard time finding virtual care. And part of it was, if I'm honest with myself, I didn't try very hard, because it's hard to find the energy to do it when you're struggling with depression. That's kind of one of the problems. There's self-stigma. And then there's the fact that one of the symptoms of depression is kind of that lack of drive, the inability to muster energy. And that's where I think we have a lot of that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality with mental health of, well, you need to get help, but you don't understand. You're telling me to run a race, and right now I've only got one leg and I don't have a prosthetic. Like, it is crippling in that way. And anxiety is the same way because of the overwhelm. It can make you kind of get frozen and in a way, like, unable to make those decisions, to actually troubleshoot and problem solve. And again, that goes back. Yep, you get deer in the headlights, and that goes back to that concept, like we covered it. Or talk about that socioeconomic difference of how that can impact mental health, because you don't have the space to troubleshoot and problem solve. So it's kind of the same thing. You don't have the energy or that space. And hey, if it helps for you, because it helped for me when I was breaking through some depression habits the first time, if you say you're too busy for something or that you don't want to do something, actually, don't want to is probably less relevant to this, but if you say you're too busy for something, try phrasing it as that's not a priority for me. Because if that does not feel good, that can be a little bit of that shadow integration work telling you like maybe that priority needs to shift then. And this is where it's like, yeah, doing things like detoxing from social media so you can get some of your cognitive space back so that you can interact with an app like Headspace or Finch. So that you can feel like you've got time to call and make that appointment or figure out the login for whatever your third party admin thingy is for your insurance, because that's always how you find stuff anymore. And like click through and figure out how to do virtual care. Like you try your best as you can to find the energy for the small steps, because it's the small steps that are going to start breaking the bigger problem. And if you can go back and try to focus on your small steps and not all of the steps, it can get less overwhelming feeling, especially once you start feeling success, right? Because we know how the brain works in that sense. If you have that feeling of success, that's going to help you give that cognitive feedback to want to keep doing those things. So find those small things that can help you. Like I said, apps like Finch, you can set a habit like making your bed and then check that little check mark. And then it feels good because you're kind of playing with that system. And maybe that can help break something for you. If you can't find energy for that, if you are unable to prioritize on your own, biggest message in the world is just don't have shame in getting help, because that I think is the biggest indicator of, well, do I need therapy or not? Well, if you can't find any energy to reprioritize, to work on some of those things on your own, I think that would be a nice logic rocks level symptom for you to be like, okay, therapy. Like let's talk to somebody. Let's see if I can get like a session here or there. Some therapists work on sliding scales, for example. There's also therapy through sometimes local colleges for the people like in school trying to finish their degree. Like they need clinic hours. That's how I was able to get therapy at one point in college. Was, real sliding scale because somebody needs to learn and I was okay with them learning on me. So, I just hope that you can find the energy to find your resources. And if you can't find the energy to go through your resources, I hope you can find the energy and the ability to talk to your partner to say, I need you to find a resource for me. Because my gosh, your partner should be your partner in this, right? Like your husband, your boo, whatever you want to call them. Ideally, they want the best mental health for you too, and can be on your team with that. If you've got friends, for example, too, it could come from there. But for intents and purposes here, we'll focus more on the partner, since that's the one most likely to see your range of life and how you're dealing with postpartum. So I hope I didn't wax on too much about postpartum depression, anxiety, and all the things that we're seeing that our culture really kind of makes it a recipe for a really disgusting soup. I'd be interested to see, what our next data set shows for postpartum depression, because you're right. Like, I'm curious if it's held to an increase since the pandemic, or has our pendulum gone slightly back a little bit? I would be insanely curious to see some of those numbers.
Yeah, maybe that would be a future Too Long Didn't Listen.
Yeah. Or if I can, maybe I'll do a little bit of digging, because I didn't want to spend too much time on that specifically, because, that wasn't like the core of the episode. But it might make sense if I can find something on that. Maybe I can find like some of the studies where they've talked about the trends, and that can be the TLDL. But lately, by the way, if you haven't caught those, they're more turning into a summary of just concepts we're covering in the main show. So that way, if you don't have the hour and a half, as they've kind of like gotten a little bit more psychologically heavy, it's at least kind of covering some of the stuff that we're talking about. So if you're finding these hard to keep up with, or if you don't, especially stepmoms, the TLDL for stepmom, I would say the one that just released, today technically, that's where it really started to take that shift of like, yeah, this can just be literally a Too Long Didn't Listen, and you can get some of the wave tops of the concepts we talk about in the main show without listening to the entire longer episode.
That's right. I love listening to them every Wednesday. For the most part, we've had some release on other days as well, but I've definitely enjoyed the increased output that we've had on this feed called Friends Talking Nerdy.
Yeah, and I hope you guys are joining for more of it, sharing it. I know I got to share. I got to share to care, Tim.
Yeah, even though it's weird being like a social media director at work and then having this podcast as well and having to focus so much on social media while loathing it.
Right?
Yeah.
It's so delicate because it's like the technology in general, right? There's good things and there's bad things, and you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater either. But wow, I talk like my 3-year-old now.
It's a cognitive load, yeah.
My cognitive load. This is your cognitive load.
Down, girl. Well, I think that is the perfect way to wrap up Motherhood Month. Thank you for leading us on this journey about mothers.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see what next month comes. I know we need to talk about more of what that's going to look like, Tim leading, me leading. If you would rather have a nail put through your ears than me lead an entire month again, feel free to leave us a comment. We're all free for feedback, but it might be psychologically heavy, so I think we're going to try to trade was the current plan. So, but yeah, I'm excited to talk about that too. I know we're still working on what some of our topics are, and it'll be another good one. I think the 2 months together are going to be oddly reparenting level healing was kind of my overall vision for anybody that wants to listen to the set of just kind of talking about the parent dynamics and what they were going through and how that can affect us.
That's right. Fatherhood Month starts next week, and a typical guy thing, of course, it had to be 5 weeks. We get to talk about guys more.
Have one more. I mean, we could always just do something on an off topic if we wanted to keep it totally fair, but I think there's plenty to talk about. We can even talk about some of the things that are less talked about, in the whole fathers conversation. I know one thing I do like to discuss from time to time is the concept of parental alienation, and that seems to stack against fathers. The numbers out there on that one, and that is an interesting. I would say that would affect somebody's mental health. A
little bit, yeah.
A little bit, like both the kid and the father in that situation, or parent, just to talk about a little bit more gender neutrally. But yeah, I'm excited to see what we end up going over for Father's Day too.
That's right. All right. Well, do you have anything else for our friends at home before we wrap this up?
No, just my exit line.
You've been waiting. Here we go. Each week, we have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Yo, mama cares so much. I'm not going to end this with a joke. I'm just going to say that same brain that is trying to keep a baby alive may also be the brain asking for help. And both of those things can be true at the same time. Be well, my mamas.
No, that's the one that got a laugh out of me.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.